Last week we talked about the Trinity. And we found out that's an idea that developed approximately 400 years after the time of Jesus. It developed out of people trying to answer the question of who exactly Jesus was. And we saw how over a period of many years people were unable to provide a clear answer for that. And we saw that what they did was eventually they just put out a statement using words, but they didn't define what they meant by those words. And then, under pressure from the Roman emperor for political reasons, those words became codified in official Christian doctrine. And the statement didn't really tell us who Jesus was. Actually, all it did was say, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. But they never did say what it really was. They just couldn't explain it. So the great mystery of Christianity is that God became a human being in Jesus. He walked the earth in every way like us, but at the same time he did not cease to be God. Now people found out 1600 years ago that when you try to explain how that happened and put it into words, I want to explain this to you. You can't do it. But we saw soon how it was forgotten back in the 400 years after the time of Jesus, soon forgotten that their doctrine of the Trinity was not really an explanation. It was just a way to speak about things. And last week we talked about, we say the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Now the sun really doesn't rise and it doesn't set. It just appears that way because the earth is rotating. But from our vantage point here, it looks like it rises, travels across the sky, and then sets. Saying the sun rises and sets does not describe reality. It does not describe the way things actually are. It's only a way of speaking of it. And the Trinity is the same way. Nobody, I don't think anybody, when they first put out the doctrine of the Trinity, they did not want to imply that there were three separate gods. We just speak of it in that way. It's like the sun setting and rising. Now that doesn't mean, though, that there are a lot of Christians who haven't got the idea that there are three separate gods. But many of them do. There's another misunderstanding that's widespread about Jesus. And this is related to a term applied to Jesus, Son of God. And this, I think, in order to understand the Trinity, you have to understand both of these together. And that's why this is a two-part thing. Last week was Trinity, today is Son of God. Is Jesus God's Son in the same sense that human fathers have sons? Is Jesus like God's biological son? Is that what we mean with Son of God? Now to look at that, I'd like for us to look at something from a man named Aristides. We talked about Aristides a number of years ago, many years ago, in a different context, though. This Aristides man was a philosopher active around 100 years after the time of Jesus. He was in Athens, Greece. There were a lot of men named Aristides in the ancient world, and this is a certain one of them. He was a philosopher who eventually converted to Christianity. And he is important because he was the author of one of the earliest surviving major Christian writings from the period after the New Testament. It's a lengthy writing, and Aristides criticizes the various religions of the Greeks and Egyptians. But one part of it is of importance for us, and he's talking about Christianity, and he writes, Christians trace the beginning of their religion from Jesus the Christ. He is named the Son of God Most High. It is said that God came down from heaven and from a Hebrew virgin assumed and clothed himself with flesh, and the Son of God lived in a daughter of man. This is taught in the gospel as it is called, which was preached among them. You also, if you will read it, may perceive the power which belongs to it. This Jesus was born of the race of the Hebrews. He had 12 disciples in order that the purpose of his incarnation might in time be accomplished. But he was pierced by the Jews. He died and was buried. And they say after 3 days he rose and ascended to heaven. Thereupon these 12 disciples went forth throughout the known parts of the world, showing his greatness with modesty and uprightness. Now this is an amazing historical document. It's dated from somewhere between 100 and 125 AD. And what's amazing about it is that at this early date, we have the essence of the Christian faith expressed. Born of a virgin, 12 disciples, killed by the Jews, resurrected from the dead, and ascended into heaven. We have the main tenets of the Christian faith right there. And it gives us an idea of what it means that Jesus is Son of God. This is what it says. He is named the Son of God Most High. It is said that God came down from heaven and from a Hebrew virgin assumed and clothed himself with flesh. It's defining what Son of God is, because listen to what he says. God came down from heaven and from a Hebrew virgin assumed and clothed himself with flesh. Who came down from heaven? God. God came down from heaven. Aristides is not talking about God sending someone. He said God came down from heaven and clothed himself with flesh. In another part of the writing, Aristides uses the term Emmanuel. That's a biblical term. It means God with us. Now notice that the term Emmanuel does not mean someone God sent is with us. It means God is with us. And that's what it means, that Jesus is the Son of God. A number of New Testament writings use the term Son of God in connection to Jesus. But nothing in the New Testament clearly defines what is meant by that. The result is that most people think it's Son of God like humans. Assuming you have a neighbor named John. John has a son named Tom. Tom is the son of John. And when we hear Son of God applied to Jesus, we think that the same way. And this is, in fact, how many Christians have been taught to think about Jesus. As saying that Jesus is God's Son, like we have human sons. That's how most Christians talk of it. As if Jesus is God's biological son. The way most people think of it, Son of God has two parts. Son is the first part. That indicates this person over here. And of God is this part, and that indicates the father of this person. This raises questions. If we're going to think of this in terms of human sons, we have to realize that it takes both a man and a woman to bear a son. Every son has both a father and a mother. Who was Jesus' mother? If Jesus is God's son in the same way human fathers have sons, who is Jesus' mother? Did God in some way have sex with the Virgin Mary and Jesus' result? Or is God capable of some kind of asexual reproduction? Now see what kinds of questions you get into when you try to think of Jesus as Son of God in human terms? What if Son of God is not two terms? What if it's one term? What if it's Son of God, one term? Aristides wrote, God came down from heaven and from a Hebrew virgin assumed and clothed himself with flesh. He's saying God came here and became a human being. That's what he said. He didn't say God sent someone. He said God came. And he had himself born of a human woman and assumed flesh. God did that. Son of God is not a term that indicates an offspring of God. It's a term that indicates God came and became a human being, just like us. You see, this Christian belief about Jesus is very specific. God came to earth. But when he came to earth, he didn't come as God. He came as one of us. As a real flesh and blood human being. That's what it means when it says he clothed himself with flesh. He took on our human nature. He became a real human being just like we are. That's what the word incarnation means. You hear that word a lot at Christmas. And it refers to taking on flesh. God came here. God himself. I've said this before. A lot of times at Christmas we had a manger scene up here. And I say, the thing about Christmas is that when you look at the little baby lying in that manger, you're looking at God. That's God in that manger. But at the same time, we believe that God still remained God. How could that happen? We can't explain it. We don't know. But that is the primary assertion of Christianity. God came here and became a human being, but at the same time did not cease to be God. That's what all of Christianity depends on. Take that out and it collapses. God coming here and becoming a human being is the central event of all human history. God did not send someone else here. God did not somehow generate some other subordinate being to come here. God himself came here. No other religion in the world says that happened. Other religions in the world say that certain gods have come here, but they came here as gods or something. But Christianity is the only religion in the world that says that God came here and became a human being just like us. And that's the starting point of Christianity. It's absolutely vital to understand. I've heard all these ideas that people have about Christianity, and here's like one of the popular ones. People sin. And God's the kind of God that demands justice and payment for sin. God demands that you're punished for sin, that you pay for it. And so here was God sitting up here in heaven demanding that all these human beings down here on earth be punished for sin. And Jesus said, okay, I'll go down there and you can punish me. And God said, okay, if you go down there, I'll punish you. And then I'll begrudgingly overlook their sins. So God punished Jesus. God demanded, I've got to punish somebody, I'll tell you. I'm going to punish somebody. So he punished Jesus. That's what a lot of Christians believe. If we look at the way Aristides looks at it, though, God himself came here and took the punishment. God didn't make someone else bear it. God didn't put the punishment on someone else. He took it on himself. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Those are two different gods. One God is the God who sits up here in heaven and demands justice, demands, I want to punish somebody for sin. And he punishes somebody else. The other God is the God who comes here and takes the punishment himself. I don't care if you call them both G-O-D, they're two different gods. The God of Christianity is the God who comes and takes the punishment himself, rather than seeing us take it, rather than seeing anyone else take it. He comes and takes it upon himself. Think for a minute what a different picture of God that paints. We worship a God who could not bear to see the punishment of sin on us, and so he came and became one of us and took it on himself. Rather than see us bear it, he took it himself. What does that tell you about God? What's God like? You see, if everyone in the world could believe that God was like that God takes the punishment on himself, how do you think things in the world would change? If we saw God as a God who couldn't bear the thought of us having to take the consequences of sin, so he came and took them for us, how would our picture of God be different? If we saw God as a God who couldn't bear to see us take the consequences for sin, so he took them upon himself, how would that affect the way we treat other people? If we saw God in that way, would we even entertain the notion that there are some people in this world who have the right to murder any man, woman, or child who gets in their way? If we saw God in that way, would we even entertain the notion that there are people in the world who are dispensable and it doesn't matter what happens to them? If we saw God in that way, would we even entertain the notion that God himself looks at some people as insects who don't matter? You see, we're getting right down to the basics right now, because now we're seeing why our picture of God is so vitally important. It's because our picture of God will affect how we look at others and how we treat others. Our picture of God will dictate what we do to other people. If we have a picture of God as the angry, mean entity up there who's saying, I'm going to punish somebody, I don't care who it is, it's going to be somebody, then we'll have a certain way of looking at other people. But if our image of God is that somebody sits up there in heaven and looks down here and he says, I can't bear the thoughts of them having to take the consequences for that, so I'm going to go down there and take it for them. We'll have a completely different way of looking at other people, won't we? We live in a world filled with hate. A world where people go around doing all sorts of horrible things to other people and try to justify it in the name of God. There's horrible things going on in the world right now to other people that there are Christians standing in the pulpit today justifying holding up a Bible. There is. Some people are always going to do horrible things to other people. But you know, the biggest danger is when people do horrible things to other people and think it's justified by God. Could you ever feel justified doing horrible things to other people if your view of God was that God takes the sin of the world upon himself because he couldn't bear for us to have to suffer it? If God is the one who was willing to come and suffer for us, how could we look at a God like that and be callous toward the other people that God created? You know, a lot of times these beliefs that we have in Christianity seem like, well, it's just technical. What's the Trinity? Well, that's technical. It's the Son of God. What's that? It's technical. But I think we've seen today why it's so vitally important to understand the true meaning of some of these things. You see, Son of God is telling us that God did not send someone else to suffer for sin. But God came here and took the punishment for sin upon himself. And that tells us a lot about what God is like. And that also tells us a lot about how God would like us to look at other people.